From the Cyber Hub bunker and studio, you're tuning in to the Cyber Hub podcast. And now for your host and CISO, James Azar.
I haven't done one of these live in so long, Cassie, and I'm so glad the first time I do it in a long time is with you. Welcome to the show. Happy Friday.
Thank you so much for having me, James. It's very exciting to be on your live show.
You know, I do these live like every morning, but I'm typically always talking to like an audience through a camera, never with someone with me in the studio. And it's been about a year or so since we've done like an actual live interview on the show, because typically we record this stuff, kind of plays out during a live broadcast. So for everyone watching us now on YouTube, on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on Twitch, Twitter, now X, Rumble, everywhere, this is a live show. We see your comments. We will answer your questions. It won't be in the comments after the fact. But for those who don't know who Cassie is, I'm really excited about this one. Let me give you a little background about who Cassie is, because she's the Vice President of Supply Chain Security in the Global Cybersecurity and Product Security Office over at Schneider Electric. Those who don't know Schneider Electric, a conglomerate when it comes to so many different technologies that they work on. She's an experienced cybersecurity technology executive in IT and product development. She used to code herself, and she grew up from the same seat many of you sat in, and she's now the author of a brand new book that you can get in Amazon right now called Software Supply Chain Security: Securing the End-to-End Supply Chain for Software, Firmware, and Hardware. Cassie, thank you for kicking off the show with your awesome book, which I had the pleasure of actually reading before the show, which is one of my favorite things to do, is actually read a book and then talk to the author about the book.
Great, excellent. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate, folks' feedback on the book as they pre-order it and read it, because I'm writing it for them, but also the people in their organizations that aren't cybersecurity people, like legal and procurement and all sorts of folks.
Well, because software supply chain is still kind of forming, right? It really is a form. But before we kind of get talking about the book itself, writing a book as someone who's an author in progress is a very long process. It's one that challenges you as a human being, right? Because how vulnerable, how real, or how do you how does your voice sound in the book is very, I think it's very challenging. It's very brave when someone writes a book. Yeah. What in the world got you into the field of wanting to write a book about this very topic?
Well, actually, it stemmed from, I'm in a community called the Purple Book Community, and we really built that during COVID to write this purple book about application security and these thoughts from leaders. And they had asked me to do the process chapter. And I went back to my friends leading that, and I said, I would like to actually write about software supply chain security. And they're like, well, what's that? And it was pre-SolarWinds. But as a developer background and, both from a product security and cybersecurity, I know the risks. So I explained to them what it is. I wrote the chapter, and the editor that they had reviewing the chapters was an author, and said, well, let me introduce you to O'Reilly Media. And I did the book proposal for them. And I started the book back in June of 2022, and it took a year and a half to write the book. It's a very long process when you're a solo author. So I was really fortunate to have a great editor, and there were delays in timelines that normally book authors experience. I really appreciate them being so adaptive to what I was working on, because this was a nighttime weekend kind of activity, and I had a large staff at the time. So it was a lot of personal time invested into it, but there are over 200 in the book alone, over 200 footnote references. So I already was very familiar with software supply chain security, but I wanted to be able to give people a lot more information to refer to if they want to learn additionally, which meant I was reading and researching thousands and thousands of pages of documents to make sure that I was presenting it well and understanding certain topics.
Yeah, you to mention your footnotes, almost every chapter ends with like 2 pages of footnotes,
Yeah.
right? Which is great because when you look at the footnotes, you realize you're really you've gone after the frameworks, you've gone after the industry standards, you've really given credence to the arguments you make in the book around software supply chain. You've given examples, you've given that interconnection. You have a whole chapter on frameworks, right?
Yes.
Which I found absolutely fascinating because software supply chain doesn't really have a framework per se. There's a framework kind of similar to SBOM, but that's predominantly federal, and it's
Yes.
predominantly being led kind of by DoD and CISA, but NIST hasn't yet come up with any sort of framework around software supply chain or something that you would consider to be an industry standard. We're almost in that stage of kind of the high trust stage, I would say,
Yes.
or the NERC SIP type of
Yes.
approach to it, if nothing else.
Yeah, the software supply chain security with the overlap with normal supply chain security, but then also secure development, it is a bit of a hybrid. And that's what I found when working with suppliers around the world. First off, sending them all the time to US government documents is, challenging. But when you have suppliers such as I work with startup and medium suppliers and international suppliers, I kept referring them to these documents, but there wasn't sort of a all-encompassing reference of what I was looking for and my expectations. And that was why it was important for me to write this.
Let's talk a little bit about the importance of supply chain security, right? We can name off a handful of breaches that would be a result of supply chain. Maybe the most recent and most memorable would be the Progress Move It one that impacted
Mhm.
3,000 different companies, 95 million people globally. You look at it, why do you think supply chain still remains almost, I don't want to say taboo because that's not the right word, but it kind of is taboo in a way where no one really wants ownership of it. There's kind of a gap in enforcing it, or where do you think that stems from, Cassie? And I know that's a loaded question.
No, no, it's a great question. From a supply chain security, just think about all the different parts. So I not only have my cybersecurity experience, but leading IT teams and dev teams. So there's not a lot of folks that really can see the entire resilience. Being in charge of DR, disaster recovery and business continuity and everything that I've had the fortunate fortunate background to work on. So when you are looking at supply chain security, how do you know the right questions is very, I know my one domain or this domain and another. So when you're asking and working with your suppliers and thinking about moving, move it, for example, you're looking at the resilience for, you might have, for example, categorized your suppliers to say, this is a critical business operation. But then you have to involve people that would really know how to assess that critical business operation from the supplier standpoint. And that's a lot of work. I mean, at Schneider Electric, I introduced a product security assessment process where we're checking evidence. And that means that, we're examining secure development and asking hard questions, because if a supplier is providing us information and let's say software libraries, or they're providing even something we might brand label, it's very important that we do that extreme due diligence as part of that. But when you have, I mean, Schneider Electric, we have 52,000 global suppliers, right? So you can't treat everyone as in going through that level. And so for the general population for supply chain, how are you going to do that? Everybody's got thousands of suppliers. If they're, M&E size, even hundreds of suppliers, especially small startups, what
Uh-huh.
information are they going to be able to get from Microsoft or some of the other companies? They're not going to get that information. And so it's very difficult. So the work that people have to do is really about, okay, I've got to assume in these cases, what happens if there's a data loss? What's my plan? What information am I providing to this supplier? So you need to take it from that approach more as you, from a risk standpoint, what am I going to do? Is there something that I can do regarding that? Because there will be more and more, and we see it now every day, move it situations and that in the supply chain. And there's nothing, even in due diligence, that you could have done to really prevent it. And these are good companies that have good,
Right.
strong security programs, but there's accidents where somebody gets phished, and there's different areas that the defense in depth layers were not effective enough, and there were lateral movements. So all of this contributes to it. So you have to assume that this is going to continue and just get worse. And that's why I include a specific chapter in the book about how to assess suppliers. And if you're a startup that cannot get that information, what can you do from a research, and what do you need to do for a risk analysis? Because some companies don't even know what a risk register is. Like, how do I prioritize this critical system that I'm dependent on? What happens if GitHub goes down for a day? I mean, what are we, as a huge millions and millions of users, there's already been GitHub,
Yeah.
yeah, outages, but also compromises. And we're so dependent on that. But what if you are reliant on that GitHub, and it's part of your DevSecOps process, and then you can't do something that you need to do? Does anybody training? Are you doing simulations for these kinds of events? And that's why understanding your supply chain is really important.
Yeah, you bring up some really, really unbelievable points there. One of the bigger challenges for practitioners, right, when you look at supply chain security, product security, and so much, is the cost of the business, right? How do you go argue for it? It's hard enough to build a security team and staff it properly, right? Most of the time, you know, HR and finance are expecting you to find unicorns. We need someone who understands AWS and Azure. They got to be able to code, but they also got to be able to document, and they got to be able to write, and they've got to be extroverts and not introverts, right? And you've got to be able to present. And you're like, okay, what are we looking for? A unicorn, right? That's
Right.
impossible. How do you build
Absolutely.
metrics? How do you build metrics that, as a practitioner, you can sell to the rest of the company to show that the investment here is actually worth it? What are some of the metrics you use or that you talk about in the book around software supply
Well,
chain?
yes,
Or
from software supply chain, there's sorry. In software supply chain, there's internal metrics. So let's first take the example of your own dev team. So if you are providing something, whether it be SaaS solution or something else, to customers, you have metrics as application security that you should be doing. This can be very detailed level. It can be high level. So some of the metrics are, first off, have you implemented a secure development lifecycle? So if you are just trusting that your developers and your teams are following secure development practices, you're not going far enough. You really need to evaluate the level of that secure development knowledge. So looking at some of those metrics, like do they have the appropriate training? I don't even, there is certifications like CSSLP on secure development lifecycle and secure development practices, and I really encourage at least some members of the organization to have those. But really being able to focus on some of the secure development practices, like have they followed, there's tools that can evaluate if they're following secure coding rules. There are metrics particularly tied to when you're doing scanning for SAST and DAST and different areas. Are the vulnerabilities remediated? What you could do metrics specifically on, do I have the latest open source library versions, or are vulnerabilities being found in older versions? So there's the flexibility for metrics really depends on the organization, but you really should be focusing on some of those application security metrics. And part of that Purple Book community I'm in, we have a chapter in that on application security metrics that I mentioned, but there's also other groups and other mentors and specialists out there that can help and identify better metrics for your organization. So if your organization has those developers, they're used to doing burn down charts and different things like that. And you can build some of these other application security metrics into that pipeline. Now for metrics for a CISO, so let's take a look at that. You can't use BitSite to evaluate the development posture and software
Right.
supply chain posture of a company. And there really are some services that are starting to evaluate that software supply chain security. There's ones that will be able to address and answer, if they do more OSINT and more open source intelligent, where if there's been breaches or any software supply chain, where they'll categorize it to that topic. So there are services that you can look at. You can look at, when you're looking at your supplier base, you can evaluate if they've got certain certifications, such as, especially in the OT space, operational technology. We are focused quite a bit on the ISA IEC 62443, which has a 4-1 SDL standard. And so certification of products toward that is very important. That means that the teams that built it had to follow certain processes and were audited in order to receive that certification. So that's a good metric that you might want to examine depending on what you're buying. But in general, for CISOs, I think there's a long way ahead of us to really evaluate, because you need to have more of these software development and software supply chain standards and overall perspective, that it's going to be impossible to tell. And I also want to mention it from a metrics is, you can't judge a full organization, because different products are built by different groups. So the Microsoft group for AI, for example, they had the data breach where they accidentally uploaded the entire training database, right? I mean, so there's, again, these, things happen, and there is the software supply chain, but from a metric standpoint, it's still a new topic. So I think from a CISO's background, you really have to, one of the things I highly suggest is, if this is a critical supplier, get to know not only their CISO, but if they've got application security and product security staff, so that you have that relationship if something happens and you're in an incident or crisis.
That's great. So for those joining us now, we're talking to Cassie Crossley. She's the Vice President of Supply Chain Security and at the Global Cybersecurity and Product Security Office at Schneider Electric. She's also the author, and what we're talking about on today's show is the book Software Supply Chain Security: Securing the End-to-End Supply Chain for Software, Firmware, and Hardware. So thank you for everyone kind of joining in here, and I appreciate you tuning in. You can get the book on Amazon. Sorry, so go make sure you pre-order your copy now. You don't want to miss that. Let's Cassie, let's kind of switch for a second, talk a little bit about open source. Big question, small question, but open source is one of those where you love it and you hate it simultaneously, right? We've obviously seen, PyPy being abused significantly, yes. The Python repository for putting in key stealers, credential stuff for credential stealers, backdoors into some stuff. We've seen that happen not only in PyPy, but across many other, kind of open source libraries. What's the balance? How do you balance risk versus the use of open source and supply chain, right? Because I think there's always a crash there between the two.
Yeah, well, I definitely think, and I believe most of us that have done development realize you don't have time to code everything. And right. You don't have necessarily the skills on your team, let alone the resource power to do all of that. So open source is a just amazing way to be able to scale and build what you need to in your product. There are certain things, especially in the open source world, that will have checklists to help balance and understand that risk. One of the items that I really suggest and think from an open source is you can do some really easy first glance checks. If that open source is a new project, less than 6 months or a year old, I wouldn't take it.
Right.
I mean, really.
Contributors. Do you look at like how many different people
Yes.
contribute to the project in order to rank it?
Yeah, and that's that second. There are services available that now will actually look at the number of contributors, but also where the contributors are located because of geopolitical issues and such.
Right.
They're being very cautious. So even on your own, when you're looking at something, find out who the contributors are and check to see what other projects they've contributed to. Is there any concern? Like, let's say but don't always be concerned about a single contributor, but you need to be careful in case something happens. For example, zlib, which is an extremely popular open source, is maintained by one maintainer who is a very great guy, but he also, I believe, skydives. So what happens? What's the backup plan if something happens,
If
right?
his chute doesn't open and his backup chute fails him, right?
Right,
Uh,
right. So using these, you can of course fork branch, maintain it, but there's different kinds of things that are recommended. You can run it through tools. I highly recommend you walk through the code. Now, if you're looking at something that's been out there for years and years, so let's take Log4j. Everybody knows about Log4Shell and such. That code was used by hundreds and thousands of millions of applications, right? And it had from a maintainer standpoint, didn't have a lot of maintainers, but it had been tested. I mean, how many times has it probably been gone through a pen test because it was part of a product? I mean, a lot of times.
right.
So you take that normal risk, but that risk is really no different in some cases than you hiring a developer straight out of college who is not familiar with secure coding practices, doesn't know the OWASP top 10. So there is and will always be vulnerabilities found in open source, just like there will be in proprietary code. And if you take the right measures before you introduce that code into your product, you can reduce the risk and look for that.
Yeah, I mean, there vulnerabilities and exploits are inevitable in software development.
They
I
are.
don't think there's a way to put an end to it because even if it's machine made or human made, there's going to be errors because there's a logic and things that kind of typically always introduce something to an environment. And I know people will say, well, with AI, you reduce it. I don't buy that AI talk.
No.
And we're not going to get into AI on today's podcast, but I don't buy. I think that's hype. One of the chapters I really enjoyed in the book was chapter 8. Chapter
Okay.
8 talks about something that I think is a conundrum for every single cybersecurity practitioner on planet Earth. Every single one. That's transparency and SBOM. SBOM stands, for many of you who don't know, or maybe the first time you hear about it, software bill of materials. And
Yes.
what is software bill of materials? It's kind of like the ingredients at the back of this Celsius can. You kind of know what the ingredients are, and in a lot of cases you try to replicate it. You don't know the quantities and ingredients, and then the same would apply. That's not this identical thing in software, right? If you know all the ingredients, technically you could potentially duplicate something, but there's other items that you may or may not be able to withhold in that. But you know and what's your use case for encouraging more transparency in SBOMs? Because I did a little research on a little Slack channel full of practitioners like you and I, Cassie, people
Mhm.
in our position. And this was as divisive as zero trust was 3 years ago, 4 years ago. People said, this is BS. It can never be done. So what's your case for transparency in SBOMs?
Okay. Well, I think that first off, the case for being able to provide this transparency is that customers want to know. If we have been, especially in the development world, operating uh, in the stealth, in the background. How we've done it has been very secret, and how we do it and produce it. So it's not only software and bill of materials, but also things like our tech stacks that we utilize, the provenance, who's working on it. All of this is part of that transparency. And so from a software transparency standpoint, this SBOMs and that whole, let's just say, movement from a developer side is extremely scary because they're going to question you. So you're right. It's no different than if you are looking at, let's say that Celsius can and or a soda can. It's like, what does that chemical really mean, and what is it doing to me? What is it? What is the impact on me? And that's really what our customers out there want to know is it's I have not seen anybody say as much, why did you choose this? Or it's just what are you using? It's not questioning our architecture decisions because honestly, they don't usually have the background to question those.
Correct.
They're doing it because they need that vulnerability management, being able to decide. And I use this because one CISO in the utility industry said, I need to know if I have to put eyes on a dial. And what he meant is at a plant, that a utility area where they've got physical dials, they need to know, is there a potential risk that I need to see if that's going to overheat or, go out of compliance of what that is. And if that means that I have to put additional compensating controls, mitigations, or any kind of resources on this, I just want to have that level of visibility. I know you may not have the fix for it right away, but by having a software bill of materials, I'll at least know, yes, there is a log4j. Maybe I should shut that off from the outside so I can't have an RCE for the moment.
Right.
And that's what's important. Does it tell them if it's affected? No. And we're a long way from what's called VEX, the Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange, where the manufacturer software publisher says, yes, I'm affected and not, because there's, that's very complex to get you that information. And it takes time to do that analysis. But at least if he or she knows, and eventually a lot of these AI tools and definitely the SIM monitoring tools, that there's a risk, then they can trigger the alerts in an organization to say, watch out for this one until we know better. So when there's a CISA KEV, known exploitability, known exploited vulnerability out there, they know there's a chance that that's going to happen. And with software bill of materials, it's going to give them at least that heat map, as our product security officer for energy management calls it. They'll give them the heat map to say, I'm going to look this direction and not. And if you don't have the software bill of materials, you have to look at a lot more. It's just like, I have no idea where my risk is based off of this brand new vulnerability that just came out. So when we get vulnerabilities in, let's say, Intel chips or something, you've got something in your laptop, the heart bleeds, of years ago. Those are much more obvious. But for open source software and some of these other vulnerabilities, if you don't know the tech stack and what's behind it, you have no idea, and you have to assume that it might be in there. And that's where the software bill of materials is intended to be, is to say, yes, maybe you should be concerned. It doesn't give you, like, if you've got a batch of lettuce, the lot number on the lettuce, but it will at least tell you, hey, you have some lettuce in your fridge. I'm going to double check and see if I should be concerned about this.
Yeah, I kind of like the idea of an SBOM where you go active, non-active, data processing, or non-data processing, right? Because at least at that point you can say, all right, we're using this library, but it's non-active. It's really running in the background. It doesn't access any data. It does nothing but provide stability, right? To something that says this specific vulnerability is significant because it does process data. It does get access to specific parts of your environment or something along those lines. And it kind of gives that, but I'm one of those people who, whenever I think about vulnerabilities, I think about them in hardware terms, right? Active, non-active components on something it matters, right? And so I'd like kind of to think of open source and SBOMs as being the same. Is this active, or is it just there because it's populating something, but really everything it's populating is cache data, just as an example, right?
Right.
Well, it could be vulnerable. It takes a lot, and it takes a specific set of expertise, which may or may not be as valid. Not everyone has the same set of skills as you so eloquently said. It's I really enjoyed Chapter 8. I think there's a lot to be done when it comes to transparency and SBOMs. And that kind of takes me to my next question for you, Cassie, which is like, should there be a standard SBOM format? And if so, what should it look like? Where it would give the practitioners, like you said, that heat map that you just talked about, but also kind of give us that peace of mind around exploitability. Because if you give too much, then the attackers are very quick to write an exploit for something. We know that. We know that today. I think CISA said that within 20 minutes of a vulnerability being disclosed, there's already scanning going on the internet. There's already people trying to find exploits and gain access, and within 24 hours they can essentially be able to write an exploit for a vulnerability. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, from a
and we've got a furry guy in the background for those that could be listening in the background. For those listening in audio, if you're hearing a little slobbery guy in the back, it's because there's a little furry that's like, hey, mom, you haven't paid attention for like 32 minutes now, even a little bit longer. Stop it, mom. It's time for attention.
Yes. So from a back to the
let me repeat the question so I can back at track. Our furry friend there wanted some attention. So what formats and what's the best way to kind of really adopt SBOMs and kind of give that peace of mind?
Yeah, so there's two main players out there on the, let's just say, the SBOM format area. And it's honestly, I've asked lots of people. I go to lots of different SBOM pieces, events, and different discussions. It's about split halfway. So I think we're at the point, if people remember, VHS versus Betamax, but even in newer technology, you've got iPhone and Android, right? You've got the two main players. I'm not sure if there ever will be a convergence into a single. For example, the Cyclone DX community, and I know members and leaders on both. And so in the Cyclone DX community, they are able to be very quick and adaptive. They're working on a crypto bomb. They're working on AI bomb. They're really able to upgrade and be able to update that format and really take in and move forward. And I really like that process and that thought, because as we go further into just besides bill of materials and go to provenance and different areas where I want to include additional information, I think that that's important. But also we have a standard, and which is on the SPDX side, which is originated from the Linux Foundation and now is an ISO standard. And that's very important, because being able to really bring this to other really international kind of let's follow this way standards are very important in certain areas. So I personally don't have too much of a preference. And in fact, the tools that we have can generate either one. It can import either one. It can transfer between the two. I think that some of the challenges that we're going to see in the future, just in regards to SBOM in general and the interchange formats, it's actually going to be more about how the problems that we're having right now is called the naming problem. It's like, how do I identify that one thing? How do I make sure that if I'm looking at the SBOM for the Apple iOS, that it says iOS version this, this, and this, and it has that actual official name of Apple, or iOS, what's the official name? And there's no database. For a lot of us, we use the CPE database, the common product database, where you can set up a name, but there's still differences, like Cisco or Cisco Systems or things like that. And there's not a standard. So it's when I'm not concerned too much about the actual types of SBOM standards and that, I'm more concerned about how do we get that CNA, that complete, like we have at the URL level, right? There's one authority where you're registering that one item. And to be clear, and that's where the naming problem and being able to say, this is exactly the same thing as something else. I mean, how many Linux SBOMs are we going to see? Because all of us are, if we forked or branched a different thing, this is our version of embedded Linux. and this is how we're representing. And it's very difficult to be able to get to that. And that's where I think more of the SBOM issues that we're still trying to address are going to come to, because you can't tell easily to be able to say this SBOM was generated from this SaaS tool, but this was built during the build process, so it's going to have different kinds of things. But is it the same product? I can't even easily do that yet.
Well, and it also gets into when you're patching, you're fixing, you're upgrading, you're adding things to
Yes.
the SBOM, and it requires continuous monitoring, which kind of takes me
Yes.
to the next question, right?
Yeah.
Whenever we onboard a supplier, whenever we bring someone on, we do these cyber assessments, and you've got a chapter that talks about cyber assessments, cyber contracts, addendums, monitoring, and again, it kind of goes to one of my first questions, which is why, trying to find a metric for a product security software supply chain side of the house and building metrics so you can build an ROI, so you can actually build a team out.
Yeah.
It takes time, but then monitoring and following up, and whose responsibility is it? Is it the product owner? Is it the security team? Is it who owns it? And then how often does it get updated? I am personally against Patch Tuesdays. I think Patch Tuesdays is the worst idea in security. And I think when you overwhelm vulnerabilities in one day, you create the kind of traffic jam that you can't get out of, right? And at that point, you're really setting things up for disaster because you're jamming everything up,
Yeah.
and so I think that's one of the challenges we have is Patch Tuesday. But what are some of your best practices around cyber assessments and monitoring these things, and kind of, you know, how do we really
Yeah.
grasp this challenge that's called, all right, we've got an SBOM, great, but these SBOMs update, materials change, things, kind of go from here to
Yes.
there.
And this is something I'm very passionate about is uh, what good is it to monitor if you don't even know exactly what you're monitoring? So let's just say you're monitoring for, let's pretend you're monitoring just for the iOS, right? So you've provided a set of phones out to your groups, and there's a patch or vulnerability, a severe vulnerability that comes in from Apple. And how are you ensuring that? But how do you know what versions are even up to date on those phones? Like if you don't control them and they're BYOD, or if you've got if you've segmented off to a different kinds of thing, environment, all of that information is, you've got to know your entire, not only stack, of what you have out there from assets, but exactly what versions are they running, because some of them may be affected and some may not. And this is really, really difficult. I'm not going to undersell this. This is one of the pieces that I have been pushing and discussing, and I even had a meeting yesterday with an asset management vendor to say, okay, this is the information in the SBOM that we would have. Yes, you can ingest that SBOM manually, but where are the APIs? Because until we have a way to be able to do an exact linkage between not only the asset, but also what software, and not just single software, because think about the 50 pre-installed applications on the iPhone, right? So you've got 50 SBOMs associated with that before you even install the other applications. So how are you identifying those and being able to trigger and do that? Because you're right, you can't patch everything. And you've got to prioritize every single moment of every single day. And until you have the monitor tools, and there's some great ones out there that are getting to the point where they can look for vulnerabilities. But if they don't have, let's just pretend that you didn't know what version of iOS was installed on that work phone. I had a work phone that was out of support, and it was stuck on iOS version 15. Okay, it wouldn't let me update, or it didn't give me any alerts that when I tried to update to the latest versions, it didn't say your phone's end of life. Never gave me that alert at all. And so that phone was at risk, but yet there was no way from an asset management standpoint to say this phone was running this version, and there itself was the risk, because we might assume it's on the latest version. This happens a lot in the OT and IoT environment where you're not patched to the latest versions because of the complications and the difficulty with patching those. So you either have to assume that you're on the original version of that and you have these thousands of vulnerabilities, or you have to track them. And until the tools are better equipped to be able to give that information, or somebody manually does it, because you don't want to necessarily do active monitoring and assessment of the versions with something that's a safety oriented device, or in a hospital, infusion pumps. So you have to know in that room it might have this one. And so we've got a long way to go. And until we get that traceability all the way through, you're not going to be able to make the decisions, let alone be able to automate auto patching of certain devices until you have the entire knowledge of what's on there, which is not a one-to-one relationship at this point, because you can have something with multiple SBOMs.
It never is. Yeah. Absolutely. The book is fantastic, Cassie. I want to thank you for taking time to be on the show today. I know we're at time, and I want to be mindful of that. We are giving away some ebooks, y'all, and so hit me up in my DMs. We'll pick 3 lucky people to get Cassie's ebook on Kindle, so you can really, get that in. And then I'll also be doing a book review video that'll drop next week of the book, so you can go check that out as well. The name of the book, for all of those who are still wondering what it is if you haven't gotten it yet, is Software Supply Chain Security, Securing the End-to-End Supply Chain for Software, Firmware, and Hardware. And it's really for anyone. So if you're building hardware, you want to get this book because it's critical. If you're writing firmware, just as important. And if you're one of the hundreds of millions of people who's into software, this is definitely the guidebook. I'm not going to give my review now. I'll save that for my video later. But it's definitely magnificent. Go to Amazon, pre-order it now. You can see the link also in the show notes for everyone listening in. If you're driving somewhere, or if you're at an airport and you're listening to the show, just check out the show notes. You can pre-order it with the link in the show notes there for everyone. Cassie, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been great. And good luck with the book. It's fantastic.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, James. It was such an honor and pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for tuning in. Again, we're live Mondays through Thursdays, 9 a.m. Eastern, with all the latest cybersecurity news on Fridays. And we don't do these every Friday, but we definitely try to. We bring really exciting guests like Cassie. If you've got someone who you think should be on the show, please drop me a DM in LinkedIn or on our website, cyberhubpodcast.com, and we'll gladly examine those guests coming on the show. Thank you to Cassie again. Good luck. Go get her book now. What are you waiting for? Pre-order it now. Let's get it in the top best-selling books in technology on Amazon and everywhere else. Until then, have a great weekend. Have a great rest of your day for everyone tuning in, and stay cyber safe.
We love feedback, so make sure to connect with us on social media and subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast listening platform.